So for the kind introduction, I'm Yossi. I will talk about my attempts to interpret the inner workings of vision models, but I will actually start with a statement about this field of computer vision and how did it look like in the past, how does it look like today. And so if you look at the field of typical papers, algorithms from the past, you will see these types of figures. People were coming up with a set of predefined filters, features. Researchers were coming up with filters, applying them on the input image to get some histogram of values. Then they took this histogram of values, trained maybe one linear layer on top of it, and that was pretty much the model. It worked for segmentation, detection, classification, a lot of semantic stuff. Now, what's nice about these algorithms is that they were fully understood. What do I mean by understood? Well, all the parts were defined by the user, by the researcher. So they all were handmade. Because of that, you could say that you understand what's going on here. But the only problem is that these algorithms didn't work that well. Now, if you look at the field today, it's very different. What you have is pretty much this recipe. Take a huge data set, a huge model, train for long enough with deep learning, and you get state-of-the-art results, right? Now, the good news about that is that it finally works. It inputs something useful. Okay. The only problem is that we have no idea why. Because we delegated the search of the filters of the features to the learning algorithm, to the deep learning procedure, to the gradient descent learning algorithm. Now, the fact that the AI engineering part gives us finally something useful, gives us finally something that we can work with, opens up a new opportunity. Because if up until now we were only doing this part, now we finally have models that we can investigate, try to understand what's going on inside of them. And that's pretty much what I try to do in my research. Now, what I'll talk about today is my attempts to put these models under the microscope and try to understand what are they doing. I'll have three parts to the talk. In the first part, I will talk about individual models and the internal structure of these models. Just like a scientist, just like a biologist, try to look inside this organism, this huge, complicated system, and try to neurodissect it. Try to see what this model is doing when it computes, when it is applied on the input image. That will be the first part. Second part, in the second part, I will talk about connections between different models. Suppose that we have models that were fine-tuned from the same source, or just random models that are absolutely unrelated. Can we say something meaningful about the relations between them? Can we say something meaningful about the genealogy, the study of families of this model? That will be the second part. And in the last part, I'll ask what happens when we take these models outside of this lab setting? What happens when we take these models into the real world, and how can we make them generalize to the real world in which, in cases in which the test distribution, nobody promises us that the test distribution is similar to the training distribution. So these are the three parts. If you have any questions, by the way, during the talk, feel absolutely free to just raise your hand and ask. Okay? So let's start with the first part. Suppose that we have the simplest model, a classifier, right? Classifier, it's a model, it takes an input image and outputs one of few categories, few classes. Now, if you look at the deep neural network, it's actually not a black box. It is a sequence of layers that are applied from the input to get the output. And what we would like to do is to look at an individual component, let's say an individual layer, try to understand what this layer is doing. Okay? And one way, a naive way to do that, is to just look at the output. So let's take this image, run it through the network, get the output of this individual layer, and visualize it. And what is this output? This output is a set of channels, a set of neurons that are in dimensions, it's similar or related somehow to the input image. And in value, it represents how much this neuron, this channel is activated on the different, on this specific image. Now, you can look at that, but it will not tell you much, right? So what we would really like to do is to somehow read out, right? Like take an intermediate feature and try to understand actually what this intermediate feature represents in a language that we as humans can interpret, can understand. So in 2020, we try to do that. The way that we did it is by reversing this process. What do I mean by reversing this process? Is we basically look at a feature and ask, what are all the input images that correspond to this feature that comes from this specific image? We basically try to invert the process, the classification process, to recreate back the input image that created this feature. So we did not only train a decoder back to the input image, we actually trained a generative model, a GAN, that allowed us not only to represent one input image that corresponds to this feature that comes from this image, but all the images that represent that, or the distribution of images. So this was a conditional GAN that takes the feature that comes from this image as one conditioning and a noise that comes from as another input to basically represent the full distribution. And reversing this noise allowed us to represent all the images that give us pretty much the same feature in this layer. And we didn't do it for one layer, we actually did it for all the different layers of the model, from things that are very close to the input image to things that are very close to the output. And back then we called this thing semantic pyramid. Why did we call it semantic pyramid? Because it gave us a continuum from things that, as I said, very similar to the image in the pixel level, to things that are very similar to the image in the semantic understanding, in the fact that this is a road, but lose all the pixel information. Because that's basically how this classifier works. It loses pixel information and gains semantic information as it processes the image. Now, it gave us some understanding. It allowed us to understand that this layer, the first layer, pretty much captures almost the full image, all the pixels. You can pretty much reconstruct fully the image. And if you go further, you can almost reconstruct only the class. But there are a lot of problems here, right? Because this model that we trained here is yet another deep neural network. We explained one neural network, we used another one, right? Now, the other neural network can have other problems, right? For example, it can represent only part of the distribution. It is also trained with deep learning, with gradient descent. It might not converge, it might collapse. Basically, what we did here is that we're trying to explain one black box with another black box. So that's a problem. And in the follow-up, we said, okay, how can we solve it? Basically, how can we explain features without the scaffolding, without adding additional components that might corrupt the real understanding, the real information that is in the space? And people tried to do that in the past. So if you look at papers from 2015, papers by David Bao and Antonio Torralba and others, you would see that individual neurons in models correspond to individual features. They basically looked at the small pixels, the small images that I showed you before, the green and yellow images, and they found that there is one neuron that corresponds to closets, and another one that corresponds to faces of dogs, and another one that corresponds to plants, right? So they went over these neurons manually, or with some hypothesis of what's going on in them, and used this hypothesis they test this hypothesis by comparing the activation maps of these neurons to what they assume that is in the image. But the problem with that is it is very not scalable, right? You actually need to come up with a hypothesis, say, okay, well, we assume that this is there will be a neuron that segments dogs. Then you need to go over all the neurons in the model and check for it, and go and visualize and compare the activation maps to these segmentations. So that's not very scalable. What we actually want is to do it. We need a language. We need some way to automatically do that, right? We need a language that will allow us to take a feature and say, well, this feature is responsible for segmenting dogs. The only problem is that these models do not speak in any language, right? It's not the visual language like I showed you before. They cannot generate these images by themselves, not the human language. It's not that I can take an individual neuron and somehow output this neuron is responsible for segments. But there is type of model that do speak in human language. These are all the models, the visual models that operate in the language space. You can think of VLMs or CLIP, models that basically connect language with images. So what we did is, in a set of few words, is looked at these models and used the fact that they work in the language space to explain individual parts in the model. So let's look at one model, which is CLIP. What is CLIP? CLIP is a model that instead of outputting a class, it outputs a representation, a high-dimensional vector. And what's interesting about this representation is that this representation lives in a joint image and text space. So you can take, any sentence, encode it with another component, which is a text encoder, into the same space, and compare and say, well, this image and this text are similar. What do I mean similar? The cosine similarity, they're very similar in the cosine similarity. And that by itself is a good classifier. You can take, the word house and run it through the model, and you can take the word road, and run it through the model, and just output the one that is the closest. So it already gives you a good classifier, but it also operates in the text space. So we basically looked at this model, at this CLIP, trying to analyze individual components. So to do that, we need to look a little bit on the architecture. You don't really need to understand what is the architecture. You just need to know that there are two parts. One is called multi-head self-attention, the yellow part, and the other one is called MLP, multi-layer perceptor, the blue part. And after a few layers of those, you end up having the representation that lives in this joint text space. So what we did is that we took an individual component and traced its contribution to the output space. Well, basically, you can think of it as computing the representation with this component and without this component, just by cutting the edge that this MLP is contributing. Now, when you look at the difference between the representation before and after, the difference is also a vector that lives in this joint image text space, right? So the contribution lives in the joint image text space, which means that we can compare the contribution of this individual component to representations of text. And that's what we basically did. So in the first paper, we basically looked at individual components that are called attention heads for different images and tried to compare them, to explain them with text in the output space. What does it mean in practice? Well, we ran many images and computed the contribution of this specific attention head to the output. And then we took this representation and put them in the joint, they live already in the joint image text space. And now we came up with a hypothesis, right? We just came up with many descriptions of images. How can we come up with these descriptions? We can ask ChatGPT to generate them. We can say, okay, generate all the possible image descriptions in the world. And we'll come up, we eventually ended up having 30,000 descriptions. And now, because these descriptions live in the same space, we can compare the two. So for example, for a given attention head, we can basically come up with a small set of vectors that correspond to text that span it, that explain the variance. You can think of it as some kind of PCA. So just an example, you can think that maybe if that's the output for an attention head number 2, right? You can see that maybe this vector explains most of the variance, and this one corresponds to the sentence and image with blue color, and this one explains the rest of the variance, and this one corresponds to the sentence to objects, and this way we can collect sentences that span the output space of this individual attention head. And up until now, it's all math. But what we found out is pretty interesting. Because if you look at layer 21, head 11, in the model, you see that the sentences that span the output space of the model, of this attention head, are photo captured in Arizona desert, picture taken in Alberta, Canada, photo taken in Rio de Janeiro. So this attention head, across many images, basically tells us, informs the final representation about the geolocations in which the image was taken. And if you, for example, look at another head 10 at layer 23, you see image with 6 subjects, image with 4 people, image with the number 3, things that are related to numbers. You can think of it as some counting that the model is doing and informs the final representation about. And you see a lot of structure. You see letters, and you see colors, and animals, and objects. So different attention heads in the model learn in an emergent way. They learn to represent different attributes of the image, right? And that's without any supervision. Now you can actually visualize it. You can take an input image, right, and look at the nearest neighbors of this image, not according to the final representation of clip, but according to the output of layer 21 head 15, which is what we call a location head. What we decided that is a location head. And what we'll see is a lot of images, the nearest neighbors are images that are taken underwater. But if you take another head, let's say head 22, head 11 at layer 22, which is a color head, you will see that the nearest neighbors are images with yellow at the center and dark background. Very similar color palette. Here's another one with textures. You see these dotted textures on the dog and on this person on the glove. So that's interesting because this model learned without any supervision to do this kind of intermediate computation. Now, why is that useful? So suppose that we want to use CLIP to classify images into images of birds, into water birds and land birds, right? So, you know, these types of images. And CLIP, as many other models, will use the background as a spurious cube. So if you take this duck, which is a water bird, and put it in the middle of the forest, like in this image, you will see that CLIP fails to classify it. Because, again, it uses the background as a spurious cube. But we know that there are individual attention heads that are responsible to tell the model, to tell the final representation exactly about this background. So we can take this representation, take these attention heads, and just remove them from the final representation. And when we do that, we improve the classification. And it's not true for one model, it's actually true for different sizes of CLIP model, from Vit base to Vit large to Vit huge, different models. And it's not that you can just remove random heads. Even if you repeat the process, just randomly drop heads, try to classify, randomly drop heads, classify, and so on. You will never get to the same classification performance. You will improve a little bit because sometimes you will stumble upon one of these heads, but it will not be as good as removing these specific heads. Yes?
How do you know what to remove?
So for this specific task, we knew before that the background is a spurious cube. Without knowing that the background is a spurious cube, you cannot do this thing. Moreover, it's, you know, when you do that, maybe you harm other tasks. Maybe for ImageNet now, you perform much worse. We never checked that, but I'll guess. But it's a good question, and I will show in a second that.
I follow that. How do you select different coordinates?
Coordinates in what sense? I select different attention heads in the model. So the model has structure, and the model has
Structure.
yes.
That means each coordinate has a label.
Yes. So it's not that it's a label that I trained for. It's just an emergent label that I were able to extract from the model performance. Yeah. Okay, so that was again one part of the model, but this part, these attention heads, that we were able to say something about them. We can also look at another part, which is the MLP. MLP is the one that has the part that has nuance, that has nonlinear activation. And we know already, as I said before, that individual nuance may correspond to parts, may correspond to objects, may correspond to semantic information. So we can trace, I will repeat basically the same process as I said before. You basically can trace the contribution of this individual nuance all the way to the output. You can compute the representation with and without that and look at the difference. And then compare it in the output space. And apparently for nuance, it's even simpler because when you look at a single nuance in the output space, it's not that single nuance represents a space, it represents one-dimensional vector. So you can approximate it with one-dimensional vector, and then given many descriptions, text descriptions of object, you basically need to come up with a sparse decomposition. You can take out of the box sparse decomposition technique and find a sparse set of vectors, small set of words that span or that basically reconstruct this vector. And we see a very similar behavior. So layer 4, not layer 4, neuron number 4 at layer 9, when it's activated, it writes towards the directions in the output space that correspond to the word snowy and frost and atherosclerosis and oak white. All of them at the same time. And you can even visualize on what images this neuron is activated, and you will see, not very surprisingly, images with frost and snow and so on. Here are some other examples. You see that this neuron 391, writes towards information about wood and cedar, things like that. And it's activated on things that have, wood in them and are wooden and so on. Well, that's not very surprising, but if you look a little bit closer, what you will see is that the same neuron, when it is activated, it writes both towards the word snowy and the word atherosclerosis. Now, these two concepts are unrelated, right? Like there is no actual reason that the same neuron will contribute to both of them. And that's something that is called polysemantic neuron. What is a polysemantic neuron? It's a neuron that's exactly doing that. It's the same neuron that when it's activated, it doesn't write to only one concept. It writes both to dog and elephant and value and cabbage and sun and all of these concepts with different amounts. So it might write much more to dog than to elephant. But eventually it writes towards all of them. And not only that it writes towards all of them, it's also activated on all of these images. Right? And just as throwback to neuroscience, apparently many years ago, there was a debate in the neuroscience community about this idea of a Jennifer Aniston neuron or a grandma neuron, this idea that one neuron corresponds to one concept. And after a few years, people discovered that, of course, it's not the case. The same neuron corresponds to many concepts, and many concepts correspond to many neurons, and it's not a one-to-one mapping. So that's interesting in the biological sense, and the connection between the way that it is implemented and how it's implemented in AI, but eventually in deep neural networks, but eventually a deep neural network is actually a program, right? Eventually it's a way to implement this program that does this classification or detection and so on. And if you think of it from the program perspective, what you have here is basically the same element, the same variable that encodes two unrelated elements. You basically reuse the same variable for two unrelated functions. And if you think of it as an engineer, you will probably know that this is a very bad design of the solution. So we asked, can we use the fact that the same neuron implements many different things to fool the model? So here's an example. Question to the audience, right? What would you think? Do you think that this neuron that I'm showing you here will be activated on this image? Who thinks that this neuron will be activated? Yes, 1, 2, 3. Okay, great. Yes, this neuron will be activated, right? Why will it be activated? Because it has elephants and it has the same value and it's pretty sunny and so on. But what happens when this neuron is activated? In clip. When it's activated, it takes the representation and shifts it. It shifts it towards the word dog and the word elephant and the word value and the word cabbage and so on. But it also shifts it toward the word dog, right? Although there is no dog here. And for this specific image, because there's so many other elements here, it shifts it so much that if you compare this representation to the word dog or the word cat, it will be closer to dog. So that's an adversarial attack, right? We basically came up with an image of a cat, clearly a cat, no dog here, that will be misclassified as a dog because we found this spurious correlation in the neuron space. Yeah.
The shifting is with and without the neuron. This
Yes.
is what you're shifting.
Yeah. Yeah. But eventually, I'm just giving it to the model. I'm not editing anything. Now, how did I generate this image? Well, it's really dumb. I just took these descriptions, gave it to a language model, and asked it to generate a sentence, an image description that has all the words, or as many words as possible from this list, except the word cat, except the word dog, and instead have a cat in it. And it came out with this sentence saying a cat launching in the sun with a group of elephants in the background and a value sign in the foreground. Now I took this sentence and gave it to a text-to-image model, and that's how I generated this image. Now, I did not temper the text-to-image model. I did not touch the language model. They're all out-of-the-box models. But basically, I came up with an automatic way of generating these adversarial examples. Now, not all of them will work, right? Sometimes I will generate images and they will not fool the model. They might shift a little bit the representation, but they will not shift it so much that it will flip the class. But sometimes it will flip the class. So here are some examples. You can see that it's enough to take a stop sign and put behind the sentence use banking that is correlated to a yield sign to cause the model to think that this is a yield sign. And you can take this cat, put next to it a hockey stick, ideally even a shovel, but apparently even without a shovel it will work. And it will misclassify it as a vacuum cleaner. And these are images that are, it's not that there is 1 pixel or 2 pixels that flip the decision of the model. It's not adversarial in the classical case. It's adversarial in the semantic meaning. Probably because Clip never saw these concepts together, never saw this connection. And that was my attempt to analyze Clip and see how can we attack Clip, how can we find spurious correlations. If you're referring to your question, well, in the previous thing, we needed to know what are the spurious correlation. Here we can just like automatically detect those, right? But there is another type of vision and language models, which are the ones that are much closer to what you're probably familiar with, the ChatGPT ones, right? The models that take an input image, you type in, describe the image, and it gives you this amazing description that is much better than what you can get with Clip. And actually, if you think of it, this model is basically a language model, large language model, that works in an autoregressive manner. It takes a word and predicts the next one, and then brings it back, predicts the next one, and brings it back and predicts the next one. And this way it generates text, right? But how this model can even take images into it, right? We know that this is LLM, but how can we enter images? So in one of the implementations, there are many ways to do that, but the simplest one is very dumb. You just take this image, split it into patches, maybe encode them with 1 or 2 layers, but basically treat them as patches, and actually treat them as words. Put them in the model as if you try to predict the next token. Now, initially, you will not predict anything. You will just keep the tokens that it generates. But once you stopped processing the image, you can start generating the description, for example. So you put in the text, and then you predict a cat, sits on the grass, and so on. Right? So that's how a lot of these models work. And it looks very different from what I showed you before, this Clip model, right? But actually, if you look at each of these components, it's yet another transformer. It's yet another model that runs exactly the same layers that I showed you before. This time, it doesn't take a full image. It takes 1 token, and actually the tokens before that. But eventually, it runs the same layers. And it doesn't output the representation, it outputs a probability, a distribution over the next word, right? So we can repeat exactly the same process. We can take a component and trace its contribution all the way to the output and say how much this component contributes to a specific word or to change the distribution towards a specific word. And we can trace the intermediate layer output into the text space. Now, not only that we can do it on the text parts, we can even apply the same technique on the patches, on the image patches. Now, it should not work, right? It's not supposed to work because there's no supervision on that. But what's interesting is that it kind of works. So if you take layer 19 and this token of a cat, just project it to the output, you will get with a high probability that there is a cat here. And with a little bit smaller probability, there is a sky and car and so on. You can just basically come up with some internal confidence. So even before you start to generate the text and before you apply the model as is, when you just process the image, you can already get some hint about what's going on in the image space. Now, if you played with these models, with these types of ChatGPTs and all of that, you probably know that if you will, if you try to describe this image and ask the model to describe it, it might fail. I mean, it will probably start by saying some good things, an image depicts a street corner with a stop sign, and will tell you about what's in the image space. But at some point, it will start to tell you, to hallucinate, to tell you about cars and trucks and nothing that actually appears in the image. But if you go back to this internal confidence and ask, well, let's go over the patches of the image and ask, do you see here a stop sign? Do you see here a car? Do you see here a truck? You will see that there is a token here. There is a patch that will be decoded into the stop sign with a high probability. But there is no patch in this image space that will be decoded into a car or truck with high enough probability. So basically what we have here is this understanding that hallucinated objects have significantly lower internal confidence. Right? If you decode them directly without letting the model to just hallucinate and write down the text, if you just ask it to, what do you see in the image right now, it will not tell us that there is car or truck here. So if we can detect these cases, we can even steer them. We can remove this hallucination, right? And apparently, when we remove these hallucinations, we basically make this model better just by directly editing the internal representation. So there are many, we did it on two types of models, instruct, blip, and lava. And there are some measures, like some metrics here, but I don't want to go into them. Basically, as you can see, we reduce the amount of hallucinated objects significantly. Okay. So if you have
What is the precise procedure to do the editing?
yes, so we actually find this. We have a threshold saying, okay, this is hallucinated, this is not hallucinated, by saying, well, if the probability of any token in the image is too high, is not high enough, sorry, right? Like if.
No, but it sounded like a chicken and egg in the sense the way you describe it, and maybe that's not the way it works. The way you describe it is, I first get the answer. Once I have the answer, I look at it and I look for validation in the image.
Yeah, so you can start with a set of all the objects in the world, or all the objects that you care about, and do it for all of them, not only for, you can do it also for words like chicken and dog and other things, and they will also have a law.
But if I wanted to do this at inference time and in the first pass immediately generate the right caption, then is there a way that as I'm computing the activations, I figure out that some of them are very low confidence and I need to have some procedure?
Yeah, you can do that. You can immediately do that once you do, right? Like you can, you will need to run one word. It's true that you need to predict the next word. You predicted car, and then you say, oh, well, let's go back for a second. Let's see if car is there, and immediately cut it. You don't need to generate the full description to make this edit. But here what we did is that we knew upfront all the possible objects in the world in this set, and we just looked at all of them up directly when we got the image without even generating that. And that allowed us to say, okay, what I want to get, what I don't want to get, and I can cut it in an early layer. Okay, so that's one way to look at models, to look at individual models and components inside of them and so on. But there's another way to look at models and say something meaningful about their internal structure, which is by looking at connections between different models. I call it genealogy of models because actually it's not that these models are absolutely unrelated. I look at models that are all fine-tuned from the same source. What do I mean by that? Suppose that you have a diffusion model. Model that takes an input text and generates images, a text-to-image model. And what I'll do is that I'll fine-tune this model on few images of one person. I will take the initial model, the huge model that was pre-trained on a lot of data, and fine-tune on 3 images or 5 images of this person. And the way that I'll fine-tune is by adding a specific token that will be the token and this token with, and I will just fine-tune the weights of the model for a while to reconstruct this image. And now, apparently, when I sample from this model, from the fine-tuned model, I can say, generate the token person with a red shirt. Generate the token person with a blue shirt. And it will work very well. You will be able to introduce a new person, a new identity into your model. Now, you can do it many times. You can start with a model, the pre-trained model, and fine-tune it once on one identity, and another time on another identity, and another time on the third identity. Every time returning back to the original set of weights. And every fine-tuning will give you a new set of weights that will correspond to this new identity, right? And of course, a new model that can generate this new identity. Now, you can do it 60,000 times and create a space of weights, treat it as a data set. Data set in which every point in the data set is a set of weights. And we call this the space of these weights. And what we found out, that it's very linear. So for example, you can PCA it, right? And not only that you can PCA, you can even sample from it. So you can basically sample from this space a new set of weights. Now you can take this new set of weights and bring it back to the model and put it into the model architecture. And now when you sample from it, you get a new person that was not in the training data, right? Now, what else can you do with this thing except sampling a new identity? You can, for example, try to find linear separators. Take all the identities in the world or in your training data and split them to identities that have beard and don't have beard, right? And just train a linear SVM between the models that the weights that have beard and the weights that don't have beard. It will work pretty well. But not only that it will work, you can take a model that, for example, doesn't have a beard, that generates an identity that doesn't have a beard. And now you can edit. You can move it in the direction that is orthogonal to the hyperplane and cross this hyperplane. And when you do that, you put back the weights into the model. Now you get almost the same person, but now it has beard, right? And you can apply it many times. You can start with a model, right? Find the directions between all the weights of all the models that correspond to flat rows or not flat rows, and edit the model or the identity in the model to have flat rows, or add bands, or make the hair straight. And all of these edits are not on this specific image. It's the edits on the weight of the model, so you can sample many images of this new identity or this edited identity, right? Now, these edits are very fine-grained. They do not change anything except this specific person, right? If you look at Obama, although you change the weight of the model, it did not affect how Obama looks like, right? What else can you do with this weight space? You can take an input image and invert it into the model. You can train a set of weights that reconstructs this specific image. And not only that it reconstructs it, it has to live in the weight space. You can do it in many ways. You can, for example, learn the coefficients of the PC principal component such that you will be able to reconstruct that. And now when you sample from this model, right, you basically supervise that it will live, the weight will live in the weights of identity, of human identity. So you will sample an image that somehow resembles the initial image, although it's out of distribution and it's not a real person. So you can start with Shakespeare and invert it into the model and ask Shakespeare to write text in a coffee house and have a tattoo, or just have a blue shirt, or take this person from Up and invert it into the model, and then generate it with green shirt or a picture of this person. And you can go nuts with it. You can, for example, if you're familiar with this, people that dogs that look like their owners, you can start with a dog and invert it into the model. What you will get is an owner that kind of looks like the dog, right? So, it's things that you can do with this out of distribution inversion by the fact that you know something about the model weights, that you learn something about the internal structure in this model. Okay, before I go to the last section, do you have any questions? Yes.
Is there like a semantic connection from that input to the projection? Because you're going through that weight space, but there's not. I guess there is still, because you're in that text to image space, correct?
Yeah.
But I was curious if there's a way to pick out like the semantics that be like, okay, this is similar to what this person is.
So you can find the semantics by doing this linear, linear classifiers on this weight space. You can say, well, this is, a person with a beard without, and without glasses with, and so on. You can do even more complicated things, but I think that this is the type of thing. So I don't know if you can do full semantics. Yes.
So one of the most popular methods for doing fine tuning is low rank adaptation.
Yeah.
Where you effectively do a low rank modification to the weights.
Yeah.
Here, you didn't say which method you used for fine tuning.
Yes.
But if you had used low rank adaptation and then a posteriori discovered that a PCA model of the weights was adequate.
Yeah.
It would have been maybe kind of expected.
Yes. So okay. So yeah, this is LoRa's. This is what the type of optimization that we're doing it is with LoRa's, is with low rank adaptation. It's still a bit surprising that it's linear. Well, we do this LoRa's across all the network, from deep layers to shallow layers, from MLPs to attention. It's still surprising that it's just linear in all of them. But I have the intuition that it will work also on full fine tuning. The only reason that we didn't do that is that it creates huge data points, right? Like every data point is a flattened set of weights that correspond to like huge weight space, right? Here we did 60,000 with LoRa.
Yeah, that was going to be my other question, which is sort of practicality. Who would like to be doing 60,000 fine tunings for every concept to produce a new edit? Like, so the ideal situation is you want to edit the activations without tuning.
So yes, but that's one-time process, right? To find these directions in the space, you just need to find one set, like to apply it once. Okay, well, you train your model with much more compute to get the final model. We did this 60,000 optimizations on Berkeley compute, not industry size compute. And it's a one-time thing. Because after you have that, well, you found the linear subspaces, you found the PCs, that's it, you're done. Okay, so yes.
Is there any layer that is more effective than other layers?
We did not look at that, but it's a good question. We did not check if there are other specific parts in the model that are more effective than others. Okay, I'll get to the last part, which I usually call escaping the lab, because I showed you some results with out of distribution inversion and out of distribution behavior, but generally speaking, all of this premise of deep learning and the lab setting that we work with is that there is the same distribution for the training and the test. And of course, in the real world, it's rarely the case, right? And we as humans know how to handle it, right? We as humans, when I woke up this morning in Philadelphia, it was cold, but I was ready for that. I was able to handle this environment and this environment and this environment. I was able to handle all the different distribution shifts that can occur to me, right? So why can't we be prepared for everything? Why can't we train a model that will be prepared for everything? Why can't we train a model that is both ready for winter and summer and all of this environment? And the answer is that there's just like infinitely many possible distribution shifts, right? If you're familiar with this benchmark on robustness, you will see 15 types of distribution shifts from JPEG to noise to blur to snow to frost, weather, coming up the situation and so on. But you can even think of any combination of every two, right? You can think of any combination of more than two. You can think of 2 to the power of 15 just without any, without even thinking. Right? So there's just like infinitely many distribution shifts, right? But the capacity of the model is fixed, is limited. Right? Eventually, I only have the weights of the model. So how can I handle distribution shifts that are outside of what I was prepared for, or what I was trained? And the idea is that instead of being ready for everything, instead of preparing my weights to handle all the cases, let's adapt the weights at the test example when it arrives. Okay, so make this adaptive computation on the test input before making the prediction. Now, how can we adapt the model, right? If we want to adapt the model, we want to take gradient descent steps. We need some signal, we need some supervision. Where is the supervision coming from? And of course, I cannot use the annotation of the test example. If I will use the annotation, of course, I don't need to do anything. I just have the annotation, right? It's a test example. But I can use this idea of self-supervision, right? Specifically, what we use is this idea of masked autoencoding. What is a masked autoencoding? It's a very simple technique. Take your input image, remove patches from the image, and train a model to reconstruct it back from the missing patches. Right? L2 loss on the pixel space from the masked input to the output. Now, that by itself is already pretty good at giving good representations. So if you train that for long enough, you fixed the model, you take the representation after some intermediate layer, let's call it after the encoder, and train an additional linear probe, you will get a pretty good classifier. It will work pretty well. But it will probably not work that well on out-of-distribution example. But what will happen if we take an out-of-distribution example, let's say this noisy image of a wolf, and before making the prediction, before giving it to the model and to the classifier, we'll keep training a little bit more, the encoder and the decoder. And once the encoder trained, we will get some new representations, a bit different from the ones that I had before. And only after we do that, we can make the prediction. And what turns out is that once the reconstruction loss goes down, the self-supervised task improves. The accuracy of the right class goes up. So to be honest, we don't have a good explanation of why does it happen. But apparently the model learns to be prepared for this new example. Right? And when we do that, we can improve the classification for many different distribution shifts. So before that, the model was pretty good at Gaussian noise and shot noise and all the things that I showed you before. Now it's even better, right? And we're better than previously. Now we can go even further with that. I will not talk too much about that because I'm finished soon. But you can do it in an online version as well. For example, you can take an input image, do this test time adaptation, get a set of weights, make a prediction, this time segmentation, because in the video stream, classification is not very interesting. And then continue training from this new point and fine tune a little bit more on the new example and make a prediction and fine tune a little bit more and make a prediction. And what you will get is an improved segmental. Because if before that, the frame segmentation was inconsistent, so for example, you can see here that there is a road, but in the next frame, there is no road. I hope that you see that. Now, it's much more consistent. You see road here, you see road here. And not only that it's more consistent, it's actually better. It's actually more, improves the results across for this task of segmentation. And you can go with this idea of test time compute, test time adaptation, to a lot of things that we as humans are very good at doing and actually do with this adaptation stage, right? So here's another example, 3D, right? Like suppose that you want to take this input image and predict the other views. And there are models that do that. They get a relative camera and they try to predict how does it look from another side, but it's very bad. But what happened, we as humans also not very good at that, right? You probably don't know how this object will look like from another side. But if you get more images, like a baby, start to play with it and start looking at that and rotating that, you get much better 3D understanding of it. So we can do the same for this model. We can fine-tune this model a little bit more and get a better understanding of the 3D. And if we get more images, we can improve it even further. And basically, the more we see in 2D, the better we perceive in 3D, right? So we basically made this, close this gap between a fixed model that gets one image and, reconstruction from multiple images to get this continuum. And you can see that basically, as we see more images, without going into the numbers, our PSNR goes up, our SSIM goes up, our LPIPs go down. So, okay, so that I would like to give some takeaways and then maybe give 5 minutes on future work. So we saw that we can interpret the roles of individual representations, neurons, weights, layers in the model, right? Not only that we can interpret and say something meaningful about it, we can find useful computational components in them that allow us to do a lot of interesting tasks from improving our existing models on specific data sets or specific cases, or introducing absolutely new tasks like out of distribution, or this coming up with adversarial attacks and so on. And finally, we saw that this we can not only that we can find these useful computational components, we can adapt them with this idea of test time compute to improve the performance, to make them be ready for possible distribution shifts. By the way, just a sentence on this idea of test time compute. Now it's very hot in the NLP community. And actually, a lot of the data sets, the ALC, I think, all of these data sets, even with relatively bad LLMs, can work much better with this idea of test time compute and fine-tuning the model, spending some more compute during test time on a specific task, even without using the latest and greatest tips. Okay, some future work. So in general, what I'm interested in, and I hope you already understood, is understanding and interpreting what's going on inside models. Hopefully, one day we will have a system that takes an algorithm, a neural network into the system and outputs some algorithm. Not only an algorithm, but an algorithm that says, well, this algorithm, this simple, hopefully simple algorithm, of course, it doesn't describe the full neural network, but it explains 80% of it. With 80% of the performance of the model can be recovered by these techniques. But before getting there, we first need to look at interpretability during training. What I showed you now is mostly interpretability of models that are already trained. But there is a fundamental question here. Why do polysemanticity emerge? Why do we see that elephants and dogs appear together, co-appearing in neurons? Can we detect that during training? Is it an artifact of the data? Is it an artifact of the initialization of the network? Is it an artifact of the training order? All these questions, I think, will be very excited to look at. Also, the fact that we can detect model bugs, like I showed you before, this example, means that we can also feed it back to the model. If we can detect these cases and mass produce them, we can feed it back to the model and maybe train the model to be more adversarially robust, right? So maybe we can use that for continual model improvement. There's another thing that I'll be very excited to explore. And finally, I would really like to apply these techniques to models that perform better than humans, right? If you look at our field, deep learning, AI, you see that there are more and more models that perform better than humans in specific tasks. If it's the medical tasks or astrophysics or a lot of other regimes, there are models that just, are trained on annotated data and just perform better than humans, and humans don't have any idea why. So if you can use these techniques to extract something from the model, to say something about the underlying algorithm that the model implements, we can come up with a new scientific discovery. And we can even automate it if we can do it discover this interpretability part in a more automated way. Just a sentence about that. It's just, I want to refer to a paper by Kim Bean, not my paper, but it's an amazing one, in which what they did is applied the same techniques that I showed you today on AlphaZero, a model that plays chess. And they extracted from this model algorithms, or at least decision-making, weights that allow to perform better in chess. So they learned these techniques, these rules, and feed it back to expert players. And that improved the performance of expert players. So if you can do similar things in the medical domain and improve the performance of doctors or improve the performance of astrophysicists, that will be amazing. With that, I would like to say thank you, and of course, thanks to my amazing collaborators, and of course to my advisor, Yossi. If you have any questions, please feel free.
Questions?
So how do you identify the shifts in the distribution when you take it to the real world? Are you doing that manually, or is that happening, by clock?
There is no manual work at all. Like, it's all implicit from the training objective. So if the image is out of distribution, the recovery, the reconstruction will be not that good. So you will get a lot of gradients in the training, right? And when you get a lot of gradients, you improve your representation. If your image is in distribution, you probably will not get so much gradients. It already works pretty well. Okay. So yeah, so that's implicit. There's nothing explicit about distribution shift. We do again implicitly assume that the distribution shift is not huge, right? If we, for example, wake up one morning and say, well, all the wolves will be called dogs and all the dogs will be called wolves, we will not be able to do anything useful. But if the distribution shifts are smooth or not too far, we can do this type of things.
Question. So I have a question on test time training.
Yes.
You said, I don't know why this happens, why, like fine-tuning test time improves performance. Do you at least have hypothesis or intuition? Because I also always had the same concerns, like why is this happening?
I have no hypothesis or intuition, but I do have a direction to tackle it, which is with these interpretability techniques. So if you have a distribution shift, and for some cases, right, we have the image with noise and image without noise. We can know what this model can perform without this adaptation on the clean image, and with adaptation on the noisy image, we can check if the representations become closer, what is changing in the representations. All of this, I think, mechanistically is very interesting to explore, but I didn't do it yet, and I'd be happy to do that.
Surprised that in the future, all my life. And for example, a chair. How do you know it's a chair?
It's a very good question. I think that
Similarly, I had a thesis years ago. How do you know it's a scissor? Testing. Cutting the same. So multiple examples.
yes, it's a very good question. I think that in many ways, that's something that I will leave to other people to explore. In the sense that eventually I end up having a huge model that already might know, might not know some elements. If it knows, again, it's a question of what is knowing, but if it knows, I might be able to extract this knowledge. And we will have to come up with, with some, let's call it a, basic blocks that we agree on, right? I mean, one way to describe a scissor, right, is an edge here and an edge here and an edge here and an edge here and an or between these edges and an end between them. But that's a level of abstraction that might not be helpful for debugging the model. It might be, helpful, it might not be, depends on what granularity you want to work with. From what we saw, right, like in our semantic adversarial attacks, the level of granularity with semantic elements, like, we agree on what's a cat, right? We see a cat, we can say, well, that's a cat. Even with that, we can, attack the model. So even here, we can find bugs. I guess that later on, we will want to go to other granularities as well. But for now, I think that even in this granularity, that we kind of agree that there is a word that's cat, even here we have bug. So let's first solve that. But yeah.
All right. Let's thank Joseph.